The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Culpeper County like a shroud, but it could not hide the spectacle unfolding in the makeshift auction yard. Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery stood at the edge of the crowd, her threadbare brown dress a stark contrast to the fine uniforms and polished boots surrounding her. The fabric, once her mother's Sunday best, now bore patches and careful mends that spoke of harder times than anyone here could imagine. "Look at that ragamuffin," whispered Colonel Jeremiah Whitman to his aide, gesturing with his gold-tipped walking stick toward Sarah. "What business does a beggar girl have at a military auction?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the single dollar bill in her pocket, her last possession of any value, earned from weeks of washing soldiers' uniforms in the creek behind her burned farmhouse. She had walked 17 miles through the Virginia countryside to reach this place, drawn by rumors that had spread like wildfire through the refugee camps. The Army of the Potomac was auctioning captured Confederate cavalry horses, and among them was a stallion unlike any other. The auctioneer, a portly man named Augustus Bell, climbed onto his wooden platform and raised his brass bell. "Gentlemen, officers, and citizens," he announced, his eyes passing dismissively over Sarah. "We present today the finest specimens of horseflesh taken from the enemy at the Battle of Brandy Station this past June." As referenced in Harper's Weekly's coverage of the aftermath of Brandy Station, the largest cavalry battle of the Civil War had left hundreds of horses without riders, creating an unprecedented opportunity for the Union Army to bolster its mounted forces through public auction. One by one, the horses were led into the ring. Sarah watched as magnificent animals, chestnuts, bays, and grays, were bid upon by wealthy officers and government contractors. Prices soared into the hundreds of dollars, amounts that might as well have been thousands to a girl who had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. But she waited. She had not come for just any horse. Then, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, a hush fell over the crowd. The final lot was being led into the ring, and even Sarah, who had grown up around her father's breeding stock before the war, had never seen anything like this creature. The stallion stood 17 hands high, his coat the color of polished coal with a star-white blaze that ran from his forehead to his velvet muzzle. His neck arched like a sculpture, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. But it was not his physical perfection that made the crowd fall silent. It was the aura of barely contained power that radiated from every muscle, every step, every breath. "Gentlemen," Bell announced, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "I present Tempest, formerly the mount of Confederate General James Ewell Brown Stuart himself, captured during the retreat from Brandy Station." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Stuart's horse, the legendary Jeb Stuart's own mount, stood before them, like a piece of living history. The murmurs began immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Sarah pressed closer, her heart pounding as she studied the magnificent creature before her. Tempest's nostrils flared as he surveyed the assembly with what could only be described as disdain, as if he knew he was among those who had captured his beloved master's army, that their horse carried Stuart through every major engagement from Bull Run to Gettysburg. Called out Captain Marcus Reed from the front row, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced the Confederate cavalry in battle. "I've seen him leap stone walls that would stop lesser horses cold, and outrun our finest mounts across 20 miles of broken ground." The auctioneer nodded solemnly. "Indeed, Captain Reed, military records show that Tempest here has been through more battles than most soldiers survive. The veterinary examination confirms he's in perfect health despite his extensive service record." Sarah studied the horse's legs, looking for the telltale signs her father had taught her to recognize. Despite the claims of countless battles, Tempest's movement was fluid and powerful, showing no sign of injury or weakness. His coat gleamed with health, and his eyes remained alert and intelligent. "What's the opening bid on this magnificent specimen?" Bell called out, raising his gavel. $500, shouted Colonel Whitman immediately, causing several other bidders to nod appreciatively at the substantial opening offer. 600, countered a government contractor from Richmond. 700, came another voice from the crowd. Sarah watched the bidding climb with growing desperation. 700 became 800, then 900. The amounts being thrown around represented more money than her family had seen in their entire lives before the war. She thought of her father, buried somewhere in the muddy fields of Antietam, and her brothers, both lost at Chancellorsville fighting for the Union cause that had left her orphaned and homeless. $1,000, Colonel Whitman's voice boomed across the yard, and several bidders shook their heads and stepped back. At over 3 years' wages for a common laborer, the sum was becoming prohibitive even for wealthy officers. The bidding slowed, hovering around $1,200 between Whitman and the Richmond contractor. Sarah's hand trembled as she clutched her $1 bill. She had planned to bid, but now the very idea seemed absurd, a cruel joke that fate was playing on a desperate girl. Then something extraordinary happened. Tempest, who had stood motionless throughout the bidding, suddenly turned his great head and looked directly at Sarah. Their eyes met across the crowded yard, and in that moment she felt a connection that defied explanation. The horse's ears pricked forward, and he took a step toward her, as far as his lead rope would allow. The movement did not go unnoticed. Several people turned to follow the horse's gaze, and when they saw Sarah standing there in her patched dress, a new wave of whispers began. "Look at that," someone muttered. "Even the horse knows she don't belong here." But Sarah saw something different in Tempest's eyes, not mockery or dismissal, but recognition, as if he, too, understood what it meant to lose everything and find yourself among strangers who saw you as nothing more than a curiosity or an inconvenience. The bidding had reached $1,300, and the crowd sensed it was nearing its end. Colonel Whitman and the contractor were locked in their final duel, each increment now coming slower and with more consideration. Sarah made her decision. $1,400. Colonel Whitman's voice carried a note of finality, as if he believed no one would dare challenge such an astronomical sum. The Richmond contractor hesitated, calculating figures in his head. The pause stretched long enough that auctioneer Bell raised his gavel, going once for $1,400 to Colonel Whitman. In that moment of silence, a clear, strong voice cut through the evening air. $1. Every head in the crowd turned toward the source of the voice. Sarah stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, her chin raised despite the trembling in her hands. The $1 bill was held high above her head like a banner. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if a dam had burst, laughter erupted from every corner of the yard. Men doubled over, slapping their knees and wiping tears from their eyes. Colonel Whitman's face turned purple with indignation. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "Bell, you cannot seriously entertain this mockery." But auctioneer Bell was studying his rulebook with a puzzled expression. "Well now," he said, slowly, "according to military auction regulations, all legal bids must be acknowledged." Legal bid," Whitman roared. The girls offering $1 for a horse worth more than most men's annual wages. Sarah found her voice, strengthened by the injustice of their laughter. My father, Thomas Montgomery, died at Antietam, fighting to preserve this union. My brothers, William and James Montgomery, gave their lives at Chancellorsville for the same cause. This dollar represents everything I have left in this world, but it's an honest bid placed by a citizen of these United States. The laughter began to die away as the crowd registered her words. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. Recognizing the names, the Montgomery farm had been well known for breeding cavalry horses before the war, and the family's sacrifice for the Union cause was a matter of record. Captain Reed stepped forward. I knew your father, Miss. He supplied mounts to our regiment in the early days of the war. Fine horseman and a finer patriot. But Colonel Whitman was not swayed. Sentiment aside, this auction is about military necessity, not charity, I maintain. My bid of $1,400. Bell consulted his regulations again. The rules state that in military auctions, if a bid is made that demonstrates particular merit service to the cause, personal sacrifice, or extraordinary circumstances, the auctioneer has discretion to consider factors beyond pure monetary value. You cannot be serious, Whitman exploded. Furthermore, Bell continued, there's a provision here I've never seen invoked if an animal shows clear preference for a particular bidder. That preference can be considered as part of the evaluation. As if responding to his words, Tempest suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his powerful frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. The soldiers holding his lead rope stumbled backward as the stallion came down and began pulling toward Sarah with such determination that it took for men to hold him. The crowd fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, filled with awe rather than mockery. Even in their limited understanding of horses, they could see that something unprecedented was happening. Sarah took a step forward, and Tempest immediately calmed, his ears pricked toward her with obvious interest. She reached into her memory for the words her father had taught her, the soft Virginia drawl he used when approaching a nervous horse. Easy now, beautiful boy, she whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the still air. I know you've been through battles and lost your rider. I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. Tempest's response to Sarah's voice was immediate and unmistakable. The great stallion lowered his head and nickered softly, a sound so gentle it seemed impossible from such a powerful creature. The soldiers holding his lead rope looked at each other in amazement as the horse that had been fighting them all day suddenly stood as docile as a lamb. Auctioneer Bell cleared his throat, clearly wrestling with a decision unlike any he had faced in 20 years of conducting military sales. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a most unusual situation. ... Unusual. Colonel Whitman's voice had risen to a near shriek. It's absurd. I offer $1,400 in good federal currency, and you're considering accepting $1 from a beggar girl based on some horse's whim. But Captain Reed had moved closer to Sarah, studying her face in the fading light. Montgomery. Thomas Montgomery of the Montgomery breeding farm. Miss, your father supplied the horse I rode through the Peninsula campaign. Saved my life twice when we were charged by Stuart's cavalry, ironically enough, as documented in the military records held by the Virginia Historical Society. The Montgomery farm had indeed been a primary supplier of cavalry mounts to Union forces in the early stages of the war, before Sherman's march had devastated much of the Virginia countryside. That's correct, sir, Sarah replied quietly. Before the war, Our family bred horses for over 40 years. My father taught me everything he knew about judging bloodlines, temperament, and the qualities that make a true cavalry mount. And what do you see when you look at this horse? Belle asked, genuinely curious. Sarah approached Tempest slowly, her movements showing the unconscious confidence of someone raised around horses. The stallion watched her with obvious interest, and when she extended her hand, he sniffed delicately before allowing her to stroke his muzzle. I see a horse who's been through hell and survived, she said softly. Look at his eyes, there's pain there, but no madness. His legs are clean, no swelling or heat that would indicate old injuries. His coat is dull from poor feeding, but the skin underneath is healthy. Most importantly, she paused, running her hand along the horse's neck. He's mourning his rider. A horse like this doesn't just bond with anyone when he does, it's for life. The crowd had grown quiet, listening despite themselves to her assessment. Even Colonel Whitman had stopped his protests, though his face remained flushed with anger. The question, Sarah continued, is whether you want a horse who'll serve faithfully, but never truly bond again, or whether you want to give him the chance to choose his next partner. She looked directly at Belle. Tempest has made his choice. The only question is whether you'll honor it. A new voice spoke up from the crowd, an elderly man in civilian clothes who had been watching quietly from the back. I'd like to point out something, if I may. He stepped forward, revealing the weathered face of someone who had spent decades around horses. I'm Samuel Morrison, government veterinarian. I examined this horse yesterday, and Miss Montgomery's assessment is remarkably accurate for someone so young. He approached Tempest, who remained calm under Sarah's gentle touch. This horse has what we call rider grief, a condition where a cavalry mount mourns a fallen master. I've seen it before, and in most cases, the horse never fully recovers. They serve adequately, but without the spirit that makes them truly exceptional. Morrison looked round the circle of faces. But if a horse with rider grief finds a new partner they can truly bond with, well, that's when you see miracles. Colonel Whitman made one last desperate attempt. This is all very touching, but we're talking about a military asset worth more than most farms. You cannot award it based on sentiment. Auctioneer Bell raised his hand for silence. In the growing darkness, torches had been lit around the yard, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd. The dramatic lighting made the moment feel even more momentous. According to military auction regulation 12, Bell announced, in cases where an animal demonstrates clear preference for a specific bidder, and where that bidder has demonstrated service to the Union cause. He paused, looking around the circle. The auctioneer may award the lot based on the best interests of the military service, rather than purely on monetary considerations. The tension in the air was palpable as auctioneer Bell continued his deliberation. Sarah remained at Tempest's side, the great horse's head lowered toward her as if they were sharing secrets in a language older than words. Around them, the crowd had grown to include not just the original bidders, but soldiers and civilians drawn by the unprecedented drama unfolding in the flickering torchlight. Colonel Whitman, Bell said carefully, your bid of $1,400 is substantial and would certainly benefit the military treasury. However, I must consider the ultimate purpose of this auction to ensure these horses serve the Union cause to the best of their ability. Whitman's face was a mask of controlled fury. And you believe this? This girl can better serve the Union cause than a veteran cavalry officer with 20 years of military service. Before Bell could answer, Captain Reed stepped forward again. With respect, Colonel, 20 years of military service doesn't necessarily translate to understanding horses. I've seen plenty of officers who treated their mounts as mere transportation, never realizing that the bond between horse and rider could mean the difference between life and death in battle. He gestured toward Sarah and Tempest. Look at them. I've never seen anything like it. That horse has been through more battles than most veterans. Carried one of the most famous cavalry commanders in American history, and yet he's standing there, like a lamb, because he recognizes something in this young woman. Sarah found herself thinking of her father's words, spoken so many years ago when she was just a child learning to ride. A horse chooses its rider just as much as a rider chooses a horse. Sarah, the best partnerships aren't bought or sold, they're recognized. Samuel Morrison, the government veterinarian, nodded in agreement. Captain Reed makes an excellent point. In my professional opinion, placing Tempest with someone who truly understands him could restore not just his utility as a cavalry mount, but his spirit. A horse of his caliber, properly bonded, could serve for many more years of active duty. But she's not military, Whitman protested. What use is a cavalry horse to a civilian girl? Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Colonel Whitman, with respect, this war has made soldiers of us all. I may not wear a uniform, but I've contributed to the Union cause in every way I could. When my father and brothers marched off to war, I kept the farm running, breeding and training horses for the cavalry. When Sherman's march reached our county, I helped evacuate wounded soldiers from the field hospital. When our home was burned, I didn't flee, stayed, and did whatever work I could find to support the war effort. She paused, her hand never leaving Tempest's neck. If you award me this horse, I give you my word that he will serve the Union. Whether that means carrying messages between outposts, helping train other cavalry mounts, or even returning to active service if the need arises. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Several soldiers nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. The war had indeed made soldiers of civilians, and many of the support roles that kept the army functioning were filled by people who would never wear a uniform. Bell consulted his regulations one final time. Miss Montgomery, if I were to award you this horse, what assurance can you give that you could properly care for him? A war horse of this caliber requires significant resources: feed, shelter, veterinary care. Sarah had been dreading this question, knowing it was the weakest point in her case. She thought of the burned ruins of her family's farm, her empty pockets, the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. But before she could answer, another voice spoke up from the crowd. I'll stand sponsor for her expenses. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Captain Reed stepped forward, his expression serious but determined. My family has a horse farm in Pennsylvania. Miss Montgomery, if you're willing, I'd like to offer you a position as horse trainer and riding instructor. The job comes with housing, meals, and wages sufficient to care for a horse like Tempest. Sarah stared at him in shock. Captain Reed, why would you make such an offer? Reed's weathered face softened. Because your father saved my life, and because I believe in honoring the bonds that matter. That horse has chosen you, and you've proven you understand him. In my experience, that's rarer and more valuable than all the money in the treasury. Colonel Whitman made one last attempt. This is highly irregular. I demand, Colonel Bell interrupted firmly, the decision has been made. Under the authority granted to me by military auction regulations, I award lot number 7, the stallion known as Tempest, to Miss Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery for the sum of $1, with the understanding that the horse will continue to serve the Union cause under her care. September 16th, 1860. 3th morning after the auction dawned clear and crisp, with autumn colors beginning to touch the Virginia hills. Sarah had spent the night in the stable beside Tempest, not trusting that the previous evening's events had actually happened. But here she was, watching the magnificent stallion eat oats from a bucket she held, his soft muzzle occasionally brushing her hands as if reassuring himself that she was real. Word of the unprecedented auction had spread quickly through the military camps surrounding Culpeper. Officers and enlisted men alike found excuses to walk past the stable where the legendary Confederate horse was now housed with his unlikely new owner. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but all left with a grudging respect. For what they witnessed, Captain Reed arrived early with a wagon and supplies. "I've arranged for an escort to take you and Tempest to Pennsylvania," he announced. "My family is expecting you, and they're eager to meet the young woman who managed to outwit half the Union army." Sarah ran her hand along Tempest's gleaming neck. She had spent the dawn hours grooming him with brushes borrowed from the stable. Master, and the horse's true magnificence was beginning to show. His coat, properly cleaned and brushed, revealed a blue-black sheen that seemed to capture and reflect light like polished steel. "I still can't quite believe it happened," she admitted to Reed. "Part of me expects Colonel Whitman to arrive with orders overruling the auction." Reed chuckled. "Whitman tried exactly that. Went straight to General Meade's headquarters demanding the decision be reversed. But the general's aide happened to be present at the auction, and his reports supported Bell's decision. Seems there's something to be said for following regulations, even when they lead to unexpected outcomes." As they prepared for departure, Samuel Morrison approached with a leather satchel. "Miss Montgomery, I've prepared a complete veterinary record for Tempest. His breeding, medical history, battle, record everything we know about him. You'll want to understand what he's been through if you're going to help him heal properly." Sarah accepted the satchel gratefully. "Dr. Morrison, in your professional opinion, do you think he can fully recover from losing General Stuart?" The old veterinarian studied Tempest thoughtfully. "Horses are remarkably resilient creatures, Miss Montgomery. They live in the present more than we do. If he's truly bonded with you, and all evidence suggests he has, then yes, I believe he can not only recover but thrive." He paused. "Just remember that trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. But trust freely given, as his appears to be, is precious beyond measure." The escort Captain Reed had arranged consisted of 4 cavalry troopers and a supply wagon. As they prepared to depart, Sarah realized she was leaving Virginia possibly forever. Everything familiar, everything that connected her to her family's memory, would be left behind. But as she swung up into Tempest's saddle for the first time, the horse's strength and responsive movement filled her with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt since before the war began. This magnificent creature, who had carried one of the Confederacy's most famous generals through countless battles, was now hers to care for and partner with. The journey to Pennsylvania would take several days, following roads crowded with military, traffic, and refugees displaced by the ongoing conflict. As they rode through the Virginia countryside, Sarah began to understand the true scope of Tempest's experience. Every sudden noise, every unexpected movement caused his ears to prick forward and his muscles to tense the reflexes of a warhorse, always ready for battle. But gradually, as the miles passed, she felt him begin to relax under her guidance. Her father's training came back to her, Steady hands, quiet voice, patience above all else. By the end of the first day, Tempest was moving with the fluid grace that had made him famous, his stride eating up the miles with an efficiency that impressed even the veteran cavalry troopers escorting them. That evening, as they camped beside a stream, one of the troopers approached Sarah with obvious curiosity. "Miss, if you don't mind my asking, how did you know that Horse would respond to you the way he did?" Sarah considered the question as she watched Tempest graze peacefully nearby. "I think," she said finally, "that he recognized someone else who had lost everything but wasn't ready to give up. Sometimes that's all it takes, knowing you're not alone in the world." 3 months later, Reed Farm, Pennsylvania winter had settled. Over the Pennsylvania countryside, blanketing the Reed family farm in pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, Sarah stood at the fence of the training paddock, watching Tempest work with a young cavalry recruit who had come to learn horsemanship. The transformation in both horse and rider over the past 3 months had been nothing short of miraculous. Captain Reed joined her at the fence, stamping his feet against the cold. "I've received another letter from the War Department," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "They want to know if Tempest would be available for breeding duties. Apparently, word of his bloodlines and temperament has reached some very high places." Sarah smiled as she watched the great stallion respond to his rider's subtle commands with the precision of a dancer. "What do you think, Captain? Should we consider it?" "The decision is yours," Reed replied. "But I will say this, there are cavalry units throughout the Union Army that could benefit from horses with even half of Tempest's ability and intelligence." The idea appealed to Sarah on multiple levels. Not only would it provide a steady income to support Tempest's care, but it would ensure that his exceptional qualities would be passed on to future generations of cavalry mounts. More importantly, it would give real meaning to her promise that he would continue to serve the Union cause. A commotion at the farm's main gate interrupted her thoughts. A military courier was riding hard up the snow-covered lane, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Sarah and Reed hurried to meet him, fearing bad news from the war front. "Miss Montgomery?" the courier asked, dismounting quickly. "I have a message for you from General George Meade himself." Sarah accepted the official envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written on War Department letterhead, its contents formal but warm. "Miss Montgomery, it has come to my attention that your unique partnership with the horse known as Tempest has resulted in exceptional service to our cavalry training programs. I am pleased to inform you that you have been appointed as an official horse training specialist for the Army of the Potomac, with the rank and pay of a civilian contractor. Your assignment is to establish a training program that can prepare both horses and riders for the demands of modern cavalry warfare. As documented in military records held by the National Archives, civilian specialists were indeed employed by the Union Army during the latter part of the Civil War, when traditional military training methods proved inadequate for the rapidly evolving nature of warfare. The letter went on to detail Sarah's new responsibilities and the resources that would be made available to her. She would have her own facility, a staff of assistants, and access to the finest horses captured from Confederate forces. Most importantly, she would have the authority to develop training methods based on her revolutionary understanding of the bond between horse and rider. "There's more," the courier said, producing a second envelope. "This one's marked personal." The second letter was shorter, but even more meaningful. "Miss Montgomery, I am Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. writing on behalf of the officers and men of the 20th Maine Infantry. We have heard the remarkable story of how you acquired Tempest, and we wanted you to know that your example has become something of a legend among the troops. The idea that courage and determination can triumph over wealth and privilege has given hope to many simple soldiers who fight not for glory but for the principles this nation represents. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she finished reading. The story of her Wanderler bid had apparently spread throughout the Union Army, becoming a tale of inspiration for soldiers facing overwhelming odds. 6 months later, as spring returned to Pennsylvania and news arrived of General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Sarah stood once again at the training paddock fence. But now the view was different. Dozens of horses grazed in pastures that stretched to the horizon, many of them Tempest's offspring. Young cavalry officers from across the Union worked with their mounts using techniques Sarah had developed, methods based on partnership rather than domination. Tempest himself, now 11 years old but still magnificent, had sired over 35. His bloodline would continue to serve the United States military for generations to come, carrying forward not just his physical abilities but his intelligence, courage, and capacity for bonding with human partners. That as the war ended and the nation began the long process of healing, Sarah often reflected on that September evening when she had stood in a Virginia auction yard with nothing but $1 and an impossible dream. The girl in the ragged dress had become a respected trainer, whose methods revolutionized cavalry warfare. But more than that, she had proven that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be purchased. They can only be earned through understanding, patience, and the courage to believe in bonds that transcend the material world. The legend of Tempest and his unlikely owner would be remembered long after the battlefields grew green again, a reminder that in the darkest hours of conflict, hope and determination could still triumph over seemingly impossible odds. In the end, it hadn't been about the money at all. It had been about recognizing that some partnerships are destined, and that the greatest victories often come not to those who bid the highest, but to those who understand what truly matters. Historical note: while this story is a work of fiction, it is inspired by the real experiences of civilians who contributed to the Union war effort. The documented importance of cavalry horses in Civil War battles and the authentic military auction practices of the period. The characters and specific events are fictional, but they represent the courage and determination shown by countless individuals during America's defining conflict.